is less demanding than consequentialist moral deliberation. Objections like being too demanding or needing a lot of time to calculate, to make a decision, or even needing a lot of time to select between two candidate rules because you want to see very clearly which one yields the best consequences. Those kinds of considerations don't arise under Kantian deontology. They don't arise simply because Kantian deontology is, to a certain extent, very permissive, which means for as long as you don't commit a practical contradiction, for as long as you do not violate the humanity formula, you may choose to go ahead with your decision. So let's go back to the false promising example. So your goal is to get money. The means chosen is to make a false promise. Now you go over the practical contradiction test and you find a practical contradiction, so you get rid of the means or the making of a false promise, but you still have the goal of needing money, wanting to get money. Now there are many things that you can do to get money. You can get a job, you can get a loan, you can ask other people for a donation or something like that, right? So donation means you're asking them for money. It's not a loan. You're telling them upfront that they will not get paid because you don't have the capacity to pay. Now, it doesn't matter which of those options are the most optimal. If any of if the other options, the taking a loan, getting a part-time job, asking for a donation, those are three different options. You don't have to calculate the possible outcome. For as long as nobody's freedom or humanity is disrespected and you're not committing self-sabotage, then it's permissible. So in that sense, Kantian moral deliberation is less demanding, or the flip side of that is it's more permissive. In another sense, though, Kantian moral deliberation is more ambitious. And this is actually the one that takes a little more time to understand. And after this point is understood, the next challenge is figuring out why it is worth going the Kantian route on this point. So Kantian moral deliberation is more ambitious in the sense that they're not going to be satisfied with producing welfare at the cost of creating dependency. So I've mentioned that before. Again, in the synchronous session, I've touched on this a bit. So the idea is, if your bottom line is welfare and you are promoting welfare along the lines of utilitarianism, if you discover that you have to create dependency to produce maximum net utility, you're probably going to be willing to create that dependency. But Kantians will not make such a trade, right? And they think there is something wrong when certain policy at the level of institutions or organizations or even of government is designed to take care of people, but to put them in a place where they're controlled by some other group or individual. So this is paternalistic. Paternalistic imposition of aid. This happens very frequently in certain unequal power relations, and that's part of the reason the Kantians are against it. And I will go over the definitions of paternalism again, even though I will not repeat everything that I have said in the synchronous session, because you can just watch the recording on that. So Kantians are against paternalism. Kantians are against interference with an individual for their own good, but in a way that sacrifices that individual's autonomy. So this is the reason Kantians are against the welfare state. Kantians are interested in welfare programs. They can allow programs that promote the welfare of certain vulnerable groups. So what's the difference between a welfare state and a welfare program? A welfare program has a terminal point. So if you have a group of people who are hungry, who are suffering from illness, or whose autonomies were made vulnerable by natural calamity or by the pandemic, if they're economically challenged because they lost their jobs, you know, they need help. You need the welfare program for that. So for Kantians, we should design welfare programs so that the target population of the program eventually reaches a point where they are no longer in need of further help and they can make decisions for themselves. A welfare state is a permanent arrangement. So a welfare state, you can look at the dictionary definitions of this, and I can even give you links to what the concept of a welfare state is. A welfare state is a permanent arrangement in government where the government's main job is to look after the citizens, is to make sure that all the citizens are well cared for. Now, near the beginning, or maybe if we try to implement the welfare state idea in a developing country or somewhere in the global south, so many populations need help. But today, what we recognize as welfare states are actually very wealthy countries. So welfare state countries that are considered welfare states include Sweden, Denmark, many places in Europe. Those are also always the countries that are ranked as the happiest because the needs of the people are attended to. Now, why are Kantians against that? That might seem like an odd idea. Why are they against the welfare state? Kantians are against the welfare state because they think that once people are capable of taking care of themselves, the government and everybody else should back off and let them make their own mistakes, let them learn from making their own mistakes, and let them take care of themselves. So the role of the government, the role of aid organizations, or the goal of grassroots movements should be to restore autonomy. If you restore autonomy, you also produce happiness. But happiness is like the side effect. Happiness is an incidental thing. The main thing is to restore autonomy. After you restore autonomy, then you should pull back and allow them to live their own lives as you also live your own life. That's the Kantian vision, right? So they are against ways of creating welfare that damage autonomy. Now, I'm not so sure about how Kantians will object to arrangements in Denmark and in Sweden, largely because the political and civil liberties and the capacity of the citizens in those countries are at a different level compared to other places. But I will discuss a very specific policy, national policy. It's at the level of government that can be considered paternalistic, is successful in producing happiness, is successful in driving a certain level of economic well-being for both for the country and for the citizens, but produces dependency. And for that reason, the Kantians will object to it, right? So my example is from Singapore. Singapore has this very unique social security program called the Central Provident Fund, or CPF. You can easily look up CPF in Wikipedia. It has a very neat description. The government of Singapore has a website on the CPF, and it has this definition of what the CPF is. So let's read it. The CPF is a compulsory comprehensive social security savings plan which aims to provide working Singaporeans with a sense of security and confidence in their old age. The CPF includes retirement, healthcare, home ownership, family protection, and asset enhancement. So it is the the analog or the equivalent social security system, something we have in the Philippines, is SSS or NGSIS. Virtually all countries in the world with a functioning government has a social security system. This is considered a safety net. It allows for macro structure policy and program so that citizens have something to fall back on in the case of accident, in the case that they lose their jobs or they're unable to work anymore. They have something, or they're about to retire, they have something to fall back on. As far as I know, the CPF is unique in all of the world. I don't think any other country has a program for social security like the CPF. So how does the CPF work? First of all, the CPF only applies if you are on a certain income threshold. So if a person in Singapore earns something like 3,000 to 3,500 Singapore dollars a month, that's roughly 100,000 pesos, but it's not equivalent because the cost of living in Singapore is so much higher. But if somebody earns that much a month, then CPF is going to be collected. For people who don't earn that much, no CPF is collected. But what is CPF? CPF is a compulsory savings program. That's what it is. So if you earn more than 3,500 a month throughout your working life in Singapore, the government collects roughly the equivalent of 37% of the individual's income. That's usually contributed as that's usually computed as 20% comes from the employee and 17% comes from the employer contribution. But from the point of view of an employer, or any organization that has employees, the whole 37% is considered as cost of employing this person. So the money is taken out automatically. Nobody has a choice about it. And of course, in Singapore, they're very strict. So the money is taken out throughout a person's working life. She does not have access to 37% of her disposable income. She doesn't get access to that. She never gets to touch that unless she reaches the point of retirement around age 65, gives up Singaporean citizenship, in which point you get the lump sum also, or something happens so that you're unable to work in the usual way anymore, in which case you get the lump sum also, but that's also like retirement, right? So this makes sure that after your whole productive life as an employee, you get a very healthy sum. And you can do something with that later on. And it will never happen that working person in Singapore retires and has nothing. So that never happens, right? So 35% of income is taken by the government from the people, and then the government takes all that amount and invests it so that actually when the people get the money back at the age of 65, there is interest earned. And also part of the interest from the ventures and investment done by the government by pooling everybody's CPF contribution is used to build things like this. So this is public housing in Singapore. It's also used to fund healthcare. So home ownership, it's already that, public housing. And it's family protection and asset enhancement, precisely because you have that lump sum. Now, you can also see that the Singaporean government is efficient in not just the collection, but in the investment and running of the whole scheme. It's not 100% foolproof. There have been some corruption allegations and some scandals that made it to the news, but to some extent, or to a large extent, those things have been addressed, and they don't degenerate to a point where the people who are retiring don't have anything to to get anymore, or they don't receive anything at the point of retirement. So does it produce wealth? Yes. Does it produce welfare? Yes. Does it produce happiness? Okay. We'll have to discuss more clearly what we mean by happiness. Does it damage autonomy? The Kantian's answer to this is yes. Yes, it damages autonomy, because there is a difference between two people. Let's say person A is a Singaporean and gets 35 to 37% of her disposable income taken away from her by the government for more than 40 years of her working life, and that's invested for her. Person B is not Singaporean and has to learn the amount to save for retirement. And let's say in the beginning, she's very young, she doesn't save. And then certain things happen and she discovers that if she doesn't have savings, she doesn't have something to fall back on when something important comes up. So she tries to save, and then the percentage of savings is kind of a work in progress. It starts 5%, 10%, maybe it increases towards the end of the working life, especially when she's earning a lot of money already. So person A and person B are different with respect to the mistakes that they could make, because so both are fully autonomous in the sense that they're working. They let's say they have high paying jobs. I'll not specify what their jobs are, but they're earning a very healthy amount, more than enough to support themselves and their families. So it's about learning how to manage your own disposable income. So the Singaporeans are compelled to only spend part of their income because a huge part of it is taken away from them. Now, some people will say, it's actually comparable to what taxes are like in the Philippines, and it's so much better because you get it back. In the Philippines, if you are a government employee, tax is about 30%. So that's very high. And of course, tax, as we know, is something that doesn't go back to you. Once they take it out, it's not invested and then given back to you in a lump sum. And a lot of people will say, hooray for Singapore, this is such a fantastic arrangement. Maybe so, but let's notice that that one of the conditions for the success of the CPF is the absence of corruption and effective financial management of the government, right? So the government is actually acting like almost like a bank in making decisions on where to invest, how much to invest, and so on, right? So it depends on those two things. If there is a significant amount of corruption and or bad financial decisions, this kind of arrangement won't work, right? So I'm just pointing this out for people who might be too excited and to say, let's have this 35% of income. It's okay if they take it, if the government takes it away from me, so I don't spend it. Not so fast. Let's kind of be careful about the kind of conditions on the ground that are needed for the program to run. Now, what's the difference between CPF and taxes? And are there, so there's no equivalent of income tax in Singapore just because the CPF is so big. So you can only imagine if 35% of your income is being taken by the CPF, you cannot further contribute to income tax. That does not mean there are no taxes in Singapore. Governments need substantial revenues to be able to provide public goods effectively. So what are the taxes that are in that are collected from Singaporeans? We have all the usual ones. And by that, I mean roughly the equivalent of VAT, so goods and service tax. There's travel tax, there's property tax. There is unusual tax connected to the ownership of cars, motor vehicles. Public transport is excellent in Singapore, and they have a small country, so they have a highly regulated system for car ownership, and that is also a very efficient system of revenue collection for the government. So roughly, a certain car in Singapore will cost more than double the cost of that same car to private citizens in virtually all parts of the world, because in Singapore, you have to buy the right to buy and own a car. So you pay for that. And there's a limited number of such entitlements available. And then also you have to pay for tax on the car. And the tax on the car is the equivalent of the cost of the car. So it's like more than double. But anyway, it discourages people from buying cars. I'm just discussing this as a point about revenue collection. Finally, in Singapore, there is also very significant sin tax. That's what we call it here. So taxes on things that are considered a vice, like cigarettes and alcohol. So here in the Philippines, this is also a very recent development. So here in the Philippines, there's also a move to have higher, actually in the vicinity of very high taxes on cigarettes and alcoholic beverages, both to discourage consumption and to produce revenue that is funneled into healthcare, so the public hospitals and so on. Now, as far as the Kantian is concerned, the goal and function of the government is to protect and promote everybody's autonomy. That's the function of government for the Kantian. For the utilitarian, the function of the government is to promote maximum net utility. In other words, the goal of the government for the utilitarian is promote health, welfare, right? So what is the Kantian objection to CPF, right? It is this. It is practically irrational to reduce people's autonomy most of their adult lives and then expect them to act for themselves independently by the time they reach 65. 65 is the retirement age in Singapore. So this is the objection that Kantians have against the CPF. And it is self-sabotage for a body like a government to take away a significant amount of people's freedom for most of their adult lives and then expect them to know what to do with that freedom by the time that they get it. What do we mean? For the most part, working Singaporeans don't have financial experience on how much to save, and how to invest, and how to manage their own personal wealth, not least in the sense of self-control. Like, I have access to this very big amount of money, but if I spend it all, I have nothing next year, right? So that's not something that they had to deal with before, because nobody had access to their lump sum savings before they were 65. And boom, when the time they reach 65, they get the lump sum. They haven't had experience with managing their finances before and managing themselves, like self-control and not spending everything, right? And what happens at the age of 65? In some cases, and this is how the government now has to run several other programs, people don't know what to do. They make bad decisions about investments, and then they lose all or almost all of their lump sum. Or what sometimes happens, and this is very tragic, some elderly people in Singapore get their lump sum and end up being addicted to drinking. Because before, they were unable to buy large amounts of alcoholic beverages because they had limited amounts of money. But this time, they have access to the lump sum, they have more money, and there are other problems in many areas of their life, and therefore that's what happens. Alcoholism is what happens, and it runs rampant because it's financed by this newly acquired amount of wealth, right? So the Kantian's warning seems to be there, seems to have been realized, or seems to be warranted in the case of Singapore, and that's what the Kantians are against. Now, of course, what they're doing in Singapore is continue to manage those things. So what happens when senior citizens who just got their CPF, the whole amount, and they made a bad financial decision? and they lose a good amount of it, maybe half or more, most of the people run to the government and expect the government to solve their problem, right? So in this case, it really happens that the government becomes like this parental figure who keeps on interfering with people's lives and keeps on making decisions for them for their own good. Kantians think this is a problem. This is not the thing that we should be working towards. We should be working towards a situation where we produce happiness, but not at the cost of creating dependency. We must not commit this practical contradiction where we try to protect people from themselves and eventually they cannot take care of themselves. That's the practical contradiction here, right? So this is the reason Kantians are against paternalistic measures, especially paternalistic measures and directed at people who don't need help because they're autonomous. In this case, they're working citizens who earn a healthy amount. Okay. Now, to end, I want to go to two cartoons I found on the internet. And this, I think, for us brings home the Kantian lesson that autonomy is important. So why should you try to do your schoolwork yourself? Why should you try to write your papers yourself? Why should you try to learn the concepts yourself, not just in ethics, GE course, but all your courses, right? Now, the problem is that if people are unable to think critically for themselves and make the kind of mistakes that are allowed and you can learn from properly in college, and the target keeps on being the final grade or just getting a passing mark, we get people, we get a citizenry unable to think critically, right? So, I like this cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes where he asks about the education that he's getting. And he says here on the second box, am I getting the skills I need to effectively compete in a tough global economy? I want a high-paying job when I get out of here. I want opportunity. And then the teacher says to Calvin, in that case, I suggest you start working harder. What you get out of school depends on what you put into it. And then he becomes resentful because he doesn't want that. That's the thing with autonomy. It is something that you have to take responsibility for. So let's go back to the question of why you should do your lessons yourself, of why you should write your papers yourself. If you don't, you lose the learning opportunity. And if you lose the learning opportunity, you're committing a practical contradiction if you allow a parent, an older family member, an older member of your student org or your frat or your sorority, somebody feeds you. So this is the problem with spoon feeding. This is the problem with people doing your job for you. You don't learn for yourself. And when you don't learn for yourself, you don't commit the mistakes that allow you to know how your freedom works and to know why it's very important to cultivate your own freedom and to respect other people's freedom. And that, in a nutshell, is the source of immorality, according to Kant. That's how we end up doing all these things that damage our own autonomy and other people's autonomy. Okay, so that's an explanation of a specific case and why Kantians are against paternalism. So that's it for this recording.